What we're going to talk about in the next 15 to 20 minutes is talk about leadership quotient and developing a leadership IQ. Now, by the time we're done, hopefully what we're going to do here is we're going to review several approaches about leadership, several models in which looking at leadership with the goal, at the end of our time, you will have a language and a model for what makes for good leadership. So that's our finish line. Before we do that, I want to ask you a couple questions, though. Now, I want you to take the next 2 minutes to do 20 minutes of thinking. Seriously, I want you to take the next 2 minutes to do 20 minutes of thinking. Think for a minute, what makes a leader, or what is your definition of leadership? What makes a leader different than a follower? So just think for a few seconds. Given your definitions of leadership and how you defined it, here's the next question. Would Hitler, Mao, Stalin, Hussein be good leaders based upon how you just defined it? Raise your hand if you think they're good leaders or leaders based upon your definition. Okay? Not necessarily good leaders, but they're leaders. I'm going to suggest, and we're going to plant the seed in our thinking here, is that why they might have held positions of leadership, I'm not sure that they were leaders. Some would consider they yielded power. They were tyrants. Just because someone has the title boss does not necessarily make them the leader or makes them a leader. So I'm going to suggest that there's something nuanced here about leadership that we have to dig a little deeper that goes beyond a formal title or a formal position. And there's something qualitatively different than just holding an office or holding power. Next question. Take 2 minutes, overall. You're going to think deeply, and then, is leadership different than management? And if so, how? Why or why not? So take a few seconds just to process that in your mind. Is leadership different than management? If so, how or if not? So again, just do some thinking. Now go ahead and turn to your best friend and see if you're in agreement. Okay, just again, because of time, and for just show of hands, how many think management is different than leadership? Okay, you're in the clear majority. This is debated in the literature, debated in the field. I think one way to get to the quick answer to that is, how many of you prefer to be managed? Or how many prefer to be led? I have not met many people who prefer to be managed. Given that, I suggest there's something different. Now, we need managers, but we're going to suggest that leadership and management are two different things, two necessary things, but they are different. But some people will disagree and debate it, and we'll come full circle. Here's another question. Take a few seconds to think. Are leaders made or born? The debate is, there's the natural leader. We recognize that natural leader early in the playground, in recess, and those are the people who are the best leaders. Or is leadership developed over time? Are leaders made or born? So go ahead and take a few seconds to think, and then you'll share with your friend. Okay, we're going to come back and answer this question. And for most people, they will say it's an element of both. I've never met a leader who wasn't born. But I'm going to suggest that leaders are made, and we'll see what the research says on that. Now, two more questions, but think about, what is your metaphor for leadership? Now, the reason I want you to think about a metaphor is metaphors are powerful because they can make the strange familiar and the familiar strange. And if a picture is worth 1,000 words, a word picture is probably worth 1,000 words. So think through, take 30 seconds, what's your metaphor for leadership? Leadership is... Okay, we're going to come back to that. Now, who is your ideal leader and why? I want you to think, and we're going to come back to this, but we're going to start the baseline here. Who is your ideal leader and why? What stands out about the person you selected as your ideal leader? What are some of the attributes, some of the reasons? The last question, don't have to answer out loud, don't have to discuss it with anyone, but why should anyone follow you? So ultimately, this is why we want to develop our leadership quotient, is hopefully as leaders, we're going to be people who are worth following, or generate a vision, or encourage people. So let's look at the leadership. What is it to be a leader? What does the leadership literature say? Now, before we get this far, though, there are two premises that I want to put out front. First premise of this whole presentation is that informal and formal leadership matters. Again, you don't have to have a formal title or be a formal leader to be a person of significance. We see that with Rosa Parks up there as an informal leader. She had a profound impact on our society. John Gardner, who was a captain in the United States Marine Corps, worked with Lyndon B. Johnson, was a scholar on leadership, and if you ever want a good book to capture the essence of leadership, his book, creatively titled On Leadership, is a wonderful read. But he makes the statement, individuals in all segments and at all levels must be prepared to exercise leader-like initiative and responsibility. So I'm going to suggest that leadership is not reserved for those with a few titles. The second premise of this presentation is that leadership can be learned. Gardner goes on to say most of what leaders have that enables them to lead is learned. Leadership is not some mysterious activity. Avalo, who studied leadership, suggests that when it comes to the debate whether nature versus nurture, if leaders are made or born, he suggests that in his studies that leadership is 30% born. You have to have some minimal qualifications, competencies you bring to the table, but after that, they can be developed. So those are the two premises, that leadership can be learned and that informal and formal leadership matters. So let's tackle this whole, When it comes to the question whether leaders are made or born, Shakespeare even gave his opinion on this. Some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them, suggesting that, yes, there are some natural-born leaders, but some leaders rise to the challenge. Abigail Adams, in her correspondences to John Adams, would say, great necessity calls forth great leaders. So the situation produces and calls for leaders. I want to suggest, I love this quote from Edmund Burke, but all that's necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. And this is why we need to study leadership and talk about leadership and encourage people to step up in leadership roles, again, whether formal or informal. So, what is leadership? How do we understand it? I asked you, one of the first questions was to come up with a definition of leadership or what makes leaders different than followers. Well, you're in good company. This is the Bible or the handbook on leadership studies. It's about this thick. It has over 7,500 references on leadership studies. And at Bass reports there are as many definitions of leaders as there are people who have attempted to define the concept. So you're in good company if you're still figuring out a definition for leadership. James McGregor Byrne wrote a book on transformational leadership. We're going to come back to this work, but he says leadership is one of the most observed and least understood phenomena on earth. We're going to talk about and suggest why leadership is hard to define, but I'm going to say that while it's hard to define, it's easy to recognize it. When we see it, we say that's good leadership. And it can be hard to define, but we sure can recognize it. So what are the different perspectives on leadership? We're going to take a walk through history. We're going to take a walk through over 3,000 years of history, and we're going to do that in 10 minutes. When people started to talk about leadership or frame the discussion on leadership, as old as most of human existence, it's been framed as leaders are great people. And it became known as the great trait theory. They used to call it great man theory, but now they're calling it great trait theory. And we have our examples starting with Odysseus, with Homer. Clever, adventuresome, bold. Plato even suggested something about trait theory when he talked about society should be a meritocracy, meaning there are a select group of people who are destined to be kings and philosophers. And so it's being wise and virtuous, and there's a certain set of the population who has the acumen to rise to that level. Interesting enough, though, Plato would advocate education was the way to cultivate the philosopher king. So while he's saying there's a meritocracy and some are destined for certain positions in life, education was the case that enabled people to that. Thomas Carlyle, Scottish philosopher and historian, in a series of lectures on hero and hero worship, he makes this statement: the history of the world is the history of great men. So when people started to think about leaders and who are the great leaders, we thought of them as great people. Great people get great things done. One last quote in this genre is Sir Francis Galton wrote over 340 journals and books and papers, a very Renaissance scholar. He was half cousin to Charles Darwin. He wrote a book on hereditary genius. Now, this has been refuted, but this captures the ethos of the talk. No man can achieve a very high reputation without being gifted with very high abilities, and few who possess these very high abilities can fail in achieving eminence. So if you're born with the right stuff, you're destined for greatness. If you didn't have the right stuff, you weren't necessarily destined for greatness. Now, that was the prevailing thought. Now, Northhouse, he looked at all this list, and people were in this genre of great traits. Well, the list kept growing, and it was getting almost endless. They were saying, well, this trait's good, this trait's good. The list kept growing. Northhouse looked at all the traits that people were talking about, and he suggested that the traits fall in these 5 areas, in these 5 themes: intelligence, self-confidence, determination, integrity, and sociability. If you look at the list, the bottom 4 for sure could be developed and cultivated. When it comes to intelligence, yes, we all know that there has to be a minimal level of intelligence, but we also know that intelligence is not as static as people used to think. It's very fluid, and it can be developed. So that's the encouraging part. But those are themes. So when it comes to trait theory, there's one unfortunate consequence, and that is it leads to unrealistic expectations. We think leaders need to be perfect. They need to walk on water. This is the source of most people's implicit theory of leadership. We all have theories of leadership. They're called our implicit theories of leadership. They came as we grew up. And this is the basis for most people's theories of leadership. And this is why one of the reasons we as a society have such high expectations for our leaders. I'm going to suggest if trait theory is your primary model for thinking about leadership, then we should give our leaders the benefit of the doubt because it's a hard job. So what's the lessons from trait theory? Develop character and essential traits. Develop some character and essential traits. 1948 was a milestone in the leadership literature. An individual by the name of Stockdale came along and he looked at all this list of leadership studies and he said, the list keeps growing. There has to be something else to explain this. So he did a pivotal work and he said the qualities and characteristics and skills of leaders are determined by the demands of the situation. Maybe it's not trait, maybe it's the situation. Maybe it's the context in which leadership emerges. So Stockdale was at Ohio State, and concurrent at the study at Ohio State, there was a study on at Michigan State. And they were saying, gosh, there are some people who gravitate more towards tasks, and there are some people who gravitate towards relationships or people. And we've heard of task-driven people, relation-oriented people. And so maybe leadership is now better defined by the situation in which it emerges. So people started to play with this. So Blake and Moten was the first to kind of operationalize this, and they called it the managerial grid. Now they're calling it the leadership grid, but in early iteration, it was the managerial grid. And they said your style of leadership was depending upon where you were at. If you had high concern for people, high or low concern for results, that's impoverished management. If you go to the other extreme, team management, you have high concern for people, high concern for results. So depending upon where you were at, particular preferences, that determined the style of leadership you were with. Well, Hersey and Blanchard came along and said, well, wait a minute, maybe it's not as fixed. We're not necessarily either people-driven or more task-driven. And they said it's a little more fluid. So they would suggest, and this is a very popular model and it still resonates with people today, and that is our style of leadership is a function of the people we work with, how confident they are and how competent they are. So if I'm working with someone who's highly confident but has low competency, I'm going to be much more directive in my leadership. In contrast, if I'm working with someone who's highly confident and highly competent, I'm going to just delegate more. So my style of leadership changes and it varies depending upon the people I'm working with. So what's the lessons from situational leadership? One is judicially attend to both people and to task. The other one is to be flexible. Leaders have a hard time with this one, but being flexible is key to being the main lesson in the situational leadership genre. Well, just as 1948 was a pivot stone in understanding leadership, 1978 is also a milestone. And an individual by James McGregor Burns, which we saw his work earlier, he coined the term or recognized there are a group of leaders who are called transformational leaders. Transformational leaders are the type of leaders that get people to do above and beyond what they normally would do. They get people to do above and beyond what they would normally do. And he studied world history, leaders in world history throughout time, and he said there are a certain set of leaders that somehow get people to do above and beyond. So he contrasted and said there are transactional leaders. The transactional leaders are more quid pro quo, job descriptions, they manage a job description. Then there's the laissez-faire leader, but then the transformational leader. And then so an individual by the name of Bass really led the research on this, and he said, what do transformational leaders actually do? And they said transformational leaders have idealized influence. They're people of character. They're people you want to hang out with because they're just quality people. They're trustworthy. They have inspirational motivation. They have a compelling vision that drives what they do, who they are. And people buy into that vision. Intellectual stimulation. They're bringing something of substance to the table. It's not just a dream, but it's an informed dream. And they understand the core competencies of the area in which they're leading. And they're always lifelong learners, so they're bringing something of substance to the table. And then there's individualized consideration. They care about people. They're relational. There's a strong referent power. So that's the transformational leader. While the transformational leadership is getting some momentum, so is servant leadership. And so I want to make reference to this. This came out of Robert Greenleaf, and there's a whole study in the servant leadership. And basically, servant leadership is saying, if you take servant to the nth degree, take serving to the extreme, that's an act of leadership. If you take leadership to the extreme, that's an act of service. In contrast to those who gravitate towards leadership position because they like power, or they like a sense of control, or they like prestige, whatever. The leader who's the servant makes the best impact because it's not about them. S Truman was known as a servant leader. And while immediately after his presidency, he wasn't rated as the best president, he had one of the lowest approval ratings. History has vindicated him a bit. But one of his mantras, one of the things he loved to be known for, to have in his guiding philosophy, is it's amazing how much you can get done as long as you don't care who gets the credit. When egos are out of the way, things can happen. So what's the lesson from transformational leadership and servant leadership? Choose to serve, develop and practice the 4 I's. The next stage of thinking about leadership emerged in the 80s and 90s, and I'm going to just show you the titles of books. This field that emerged is more of the wisdom genre, and it took on a sage-like perspective. So Dupree wrote a book, Leadership as an Art. Bowman and Deal, Leading with the Soul, An Uncommon Journey of the Spirit. Wren, The Leader's Companion, Insight Through the Ages. And then Sample, who was the former president of the University of Southern California, wrote a book called The Contrarian's Guide to Leadership. So you sense that they're looking for wisdom. They're saying these traditional ways of thinking aren't working. There has to be something a bit more transcendent. So they're appealing to wisdom. I asked you earlier who your ideal leaders are and what are the behaviors of exemplary leader. This was a study done with over 75,000 participants, started in the 80s by people named Kouzes and Posner, and they've been asking managers this exact question. And what's interesting, the same 4 values or 4 attributes keep emerging. And they've done it internationally, and no matter where you are at, these 4 top values make for exemplary leadership. So what are the characteristics you most look for and admire? These again were asked to the managers. Here's what emerged. Honesty. Being honest. Being forward-looking. Vision, what's coming ahead. Inspiring. And a degree of competency. And what they concluded, these are the top 4, that these give to credibility. And so they wrote a book called Credibility, How People Gain It and Lose It. And then they did something even more fascinating. They unpacked these people's credibility. What are they actually doing in the field? And they wrote a book called The Leadership Challenge, How to Make Extraordinary Things Happen. But when you think of ideal leaders, I'm going to suggest that honesty, forward-looking, inspiring, and competency should be at the top of our list. And that's what emerges over and over. So, one last look in the empirical. Jim Collins wrote a book with a colleague called Built to Last. How many read Built to Last? Any? And then a second book was Good to Great. How many read Good to Great? Wonderful book. But in the book Built to Last, they looked at these organizations that have stood the test of time and said what allowed them to succeed. Well, after they wrote that book, people came to them and said, well, that was great because those companies had a wonderful foundation. What about companies that are just starting out? How do you go from being good to being great? One of the things that they found that's very relevant to developing a leadership quotient, that good to great companies had what he called level 5 leaders. Now, other organizations had good and competent leaders, but level 5 leaders had this blend of humility and a strong professional commitment and will. So, here's a model of forceful integrity. and transformational leadership. If you're familiar with George Marshall, he was the Chief of Staff for the Army, he was Secretary of State, he developed the Marshall Plan, he won the Nobel Peace Prize, he was on Time cover 6 times, and he was Time Person of the Year 2 times. Whatever you read or people talk about him, just was a humble man, but a highly capable man. And what's interesting is, when 1953, when he was the U.S. representative to the coronation for Queen Elizabeth, he walks into Westminster and he's talking to his aide, and all of a sudden people start to stand and applaud. Now that's unheard of in Westminster Abbey unless it's for royalty. So he walks around and he goes, "Who are they clapping?" And they said, "For you, sir." He was that well revered. The other interesting thing about George Marshall is that he was, as Chief of Staff and Secretary of State, all the War II generals were getting millions for writing biographies, autobiographies, memoirs, telling their story. He refused to write because he goes, it would not be fair. What I know would not be fair, and he didn't want to have any way of mistreating his colleagues. So he refused millions of royalties. So what are the lessons from the sage and empirical side of leadership? Develop and exercise wisdom. Leadership is both an art and a science. And practice humility. What is your metaphor of leadership? I'm going to go really fast here. We actually asked university scholars, presidents, civic business leaders, what is their metaphor for leadership? And we asked them to explain it. We had over 1,000 responses. Interesting enough, about 1/3 of the responses that came in dealt with navigational themes. And you can see some of the metaphors there. Some emphasized the journey, some emphasized the destination. The journey, herding butterflies, herding cats, destination, captain of a ship. That was some of their explanation. Just under 1/3 of the metaphors were nurturing metaphors. The coach, the parent. Some emphasized being a secondary caregiver, some emphasized being a primary caregiver. The other 1/3 emphasized more performance. Some emphasized at the beginning stages what emerges. Some emphasized more with the goal, the telegenetic, with the goal in mind. So those were some of the more common metaphors. So 1/3 were navigational, less than 1/3 were performance-based, and 1/3 were nurturing. I'm going to suggest that when people think of leadership, they tend to think of one aspect or one facet of this triangle. And this research suggests that leadership is multifaceted, and if we pay attention to one facet at the expense of the other facets, we'll probably sabotage our sense of leadership or our leadership potential. So those are some leadership metaphors. And so that's how it looks like. If you want to develop a metaphor for leadership, suggest that it includes being a navigator, a nurturer, and a performer. Now, I mentioned that we got 1,000 responses. What's interesting, about half the people who responded gave a metaphor. The other half of the people gave descriptions like its integrity. Now that either suggests that people do not know what a metaphor is, or that leadership's too complex to capture for where they're at. But interesting enough, that data is still relevant because almost half the other responses dealt with issues of character, trust, being an example. I want to end by reading a speech from, parts of a quote from a speech that Theodore Roosevelt gave, and it's called "The Citizenship in a Republic." And this was after his presidency, and he's giving a speech in Paris. "It's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles, or where the doer of deeds could have done better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs and comes short again and again because there is no effort without error and shortcoming. But who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows the great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who know neither victory nor defeat." So when it comes to developing a leadership quotient, get in the arena. Cultivate the essential traits. Be flexible. Be transformational. Choose to be a servant. Be wise. And attend equally to the essential aspects of navigating, performing, and nurturing. Do the right things the right way. So I wish you well in your leadership pursuits. I want to end with Jesus. When he sent out his disciples into the multitudes, he told them to be as shrewd as serpents and innocent as doves. So God bless and thank you.